All right, says I'm live. This is unplanned. There's been an issue that just came up on religious tolerance here, not religious tolerance, philosophy of religion page as a reference to an issue of who bears burden of proof. And because there was a big argument the other day on a modus ponens claim about whether a gyroscope proves Earth rotation because of a 15-degree drift. And the argument was not over whether that was proof. The argument was over whether it's a valid form of a logical claim and logical argument, whether it's valid, and who bears the burden of proof. I think that was the real key, is who bears the burden of proof. And so what I did is I wanted to, Eagle, good to see you. I wanted to look this up and Uni, get this claim, not a claim, but a definition about shifting the burden of proof that says the burden of proof is always on the person making an assertion or proposition. Shifting the burden of proof, a special case of argumentum ad ignorantium, is the fallacy of putting the burden of proof on the person who denies or questions the assertion being made. The source of the fallacy is the assumption that something is true unless proven otherwise. So just because someone has a valid form of an argument, I'm probably mangling this, but I didn't write it down or anything, but basically that if the gyroscope shows 15 degrees drift, then it proves Earth rotation at that speed. But that is a valid form. That is a valid modus ponens argument. But that doesn't mean that the person making that valid argument bears the burden of proof. That doesn't change. The person who asserts the premise that the 15 degrees, not just that it exists, but that it proves something, that whole argument is saying that this drift proves something. Okay? And the question can't be answered without the person making the claim showing how it proves that. So just because drift is observed in the gyroscope doesn't prove anything but that drift is observed. So the burden of proving that it means something else, that the Earth is rotating, still rests upon the person making the argument, the valid modus ponens argument with a valid, on its surface, the premise is valid that 15 degrees rotation has been observed. But it's a non sequitur to say that that result can only be observed if there is Earth rotation. That's where the error lies. So it is not something you can just dismiss and saying it's an invalid argument, because it's not an invalid argument. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that if you dispute the claim that you bear the burden of proof. It doesn't mean that either. So in my opinion, there were two sides arguing, one saying dismiss the whole thing out of hand, and the other saying that we bear the burden of proof if we disagree with the conclusion. They're both wrong, in my opinion. So you have a valid argument, a modus ponens argument, if P then Q, P therefore Q. If the gyroscope shows 15 degrees drift, then that's P, and then Q would be then Earth is rotating. Valid form of argument, valid observation, but not a valid conclusion, and the burden of proof lies with the one making the claim, not the one challenging the claim. So you can't shift burden of proof just because the argument itself is in a valid form and the observation is valid. That doesn't shift burden of proof. You still have to prove that 15-degree drift on a gyroscope means that the only cause is Earth rotation. So that's where the problem lies. So again, I saw, and this went on for I don't know how long, both sides were making an error, in my opinion. So yeah, you have a valid form of an argument, check the logic box off. You have a valid observational premise, got that too. But the conclusion does not follow because there is no attempt to falsify, that is to say, no null hypothesis, saying that this is proof of some scientific fact. So I think it was oversimplified, is why they were arguing for I don't know how long on who bore the burden of proof and whether it should be addressed at all. I think it should be addressed. I think if somebody says that here's my valid modus ponens argument, we have a valid observation, therefore the conclusion must be true, that is a non sequitur. That's where the error lies. So you can't just hand wave dismiss it, but you also can't shift the burden of proof. And that's why I think the argument was not resolved, because both sides were missing something, in my opinion. So any of you who are familiar with the argument that was going on yesterday, hope this helps. For anybody who doesn't know what the heck I'm talking about, just take this as a general point that even if someone makes a logically valid argument, it doesn't mean that there's no error in the conclusion, even if the premise is correct, because by saying if rotation that, or if drift then rotation, that itself is the fallacy. It's a non sequitur, because you cannot prove that there is no other cause for the observed drift on the gyroscope, that it must necessarily mean P must lead to Q. And that's the problem. So I don't know if that helps clear it up, but this is important, that you have both good logic and good science. You can't dismiss one or the other. I've often said that bad logic makes bad science. But the reverse is true as well, because even though, like I said, you can check off every logical checkbox there, the one you're missing is the non sequitur that necessarily, if drift, then rotation. I don't think that's been established. So yes, it should be investigated. It should not be hand wave dismissed. But on the other hand, who has to prove it? Not the negative, not the one disputing the claim, the one making the claim. So the one making the argument, if drift, then rotation, that person bears the burden of proof to show that drift must necessarily be caused by rotation. That has not been established. So, quick look at the chat. Thanks for anybody at all showing up. We got 11. That's pretty good for no planning ahead or anything, or no announcement. Good to see Eagle Plane and Anchor, Unicorn, Laser Eyes, Michael B. Boy, I can't see that text. Let me see. Shields versus Shills. Okay, interesting name. And you brought up ether. From what I've read, and let me see if I can get a link real quick for that, because I wrote a thing about light that I've never gotten a response to, so I'm going to put that in the chat there. In my opinion, it's a very brief look at the history of how people, science in general, mainstream science, came to the conclusions they did about light and quantum theory and all that. The problem is that it seems that the whole concept of ether, which is now being called quantum fluid or something like that, same thing, that was all proposed in an attempt to solve the problem of light traveling through the vacuum of space. Well, we know light travels through vacuums because vacuum tubes produce light that we can see. But light, if it's a wave, must propagate through some material, just as water, if you drop a pebble in it, will create disturbances which are waves of water, not of the pebble, and the pebble is at a right angle to the water, so the waves reaching you are the result of a disturbance in something that already exists that you didn't see before it was disturbed. So if light is a wave, it either, and I've gone into this on my cosmology playlist on light, different types of waves. There's transverse waves, longitudinal waves. But the problem is, whatever kind of wave you have, there has to be stuff that's waving. And just as water is made of molecules and is not made of waves, nonetheless, water will wave. If it's disturbed, if there's a bunch of it. Something like that would have to be true of light. And that's why they came up with ether originally. In my opinion, I could be missing something, but what I've seen so far is a way to explain what exactly is making the waves. Because it can't be, light is the result of something waving if light is a wave. Which again, it's nonsense to say light is a wave, just as it's nonsense to say water is a wave. But can light be the result of something waving? That's the question. And ether was proposed as an answer because they started with the assumption that space is a vacuum. If there is no space or is no vacuum, or both, of course, then why do we need to talk about ether or quantum fluid? That's the question. So anyway, just to mention that about ether. Both sides in the modus ponens argument on if drift then rotation, both sides were missing something in my opinion. And ether, I still want someone to answer the question, without a vacuum of space, does ether even matter? So hopefully somebody will come up with something on that. There was a logical point being missed on both sides of that argument. And again, most of you, I think, here are familiar with what was going on. And if you weren't, don't worry about it. Good to see also more names in the chat. Let's see. Rakia Life, AJM, I think I mentioned Michael B. Colin Dresser, Rachel Menifee, AR, Dorian Gray, Flatzoid, Unicorn, I think I mentioned you. God created light before the luminaries. Yes, he did. Light is a mystery, as far as I'm concerned. Amanda Young, and I don't think I missed anybody else. So, you get what I'm saying? You get my drift. Speaking of drift, the two issues are, I'll go with the second one first. Without a vacuum of space, do we even need to talk about ether? And the first one, burden of proof cannot be shifted just because somebody has a logically sound argument. Because, once again, just to emphasize, the proposal is made that if there's drift in a gyroscope, then Earth rotation must be causing it. And that, in my opinion, is a non sequitur. The person making that claim bears the burden of proof. So yes, they who say drift equal rotation bear the burden of proof to say that that's so and that nothing else can cause it. And yet at the same time, it shouldn't be hand-wave dismissed just because it's a non sequitur. I think it's an important issue for them to prove. But again, them to prove, not those who disagree with the conclusion to prove. We don't bear that burden of proof. So could the ether not just be waters above? Again, do we need ether? Is there a vacuum anywhere? Because in my opinion, ether is only an issue because of vacuum. You have to have something to wave. So if there's no vacuum, then there's no need for ether. That's the question I'm proposing that someone deal with. The speed of light changes. Again, that link I provided goes into that question. Thank you for kind comments. Let's see, gas without a container, of course, that's impossible. You can have gas without a container, but you can't have gas pressure without a container. If there's no gas pressure being read, then of course you don't need a container and probably don't have one, or you didn't put any gas in the container. Anyway, yes, a valid argument is not necessarily a true statement. That's the issue. It is a valid modus ponens, but an invalid in the sense of being a non sequitur, and it's wrong to shift the burden of proof to those who disagree with the claim, the proposal that drift equals rotation. So yeah, and that's the thing. To look into the drift issue, you would have to say there is no other possible cause of drift. You have to rule them out. And I don't think any attempt has been made to do that. So, hey Amanda, good to see you too. So I'm keeping this short because I just wanted to make that one point. And again, the challenge is out to see, well, first of all, two challenges. One is to prove that there's no other possible cause of gyroscope drift. And the other, that without a vacuum of space, does ether even matter? Is it needed? So there you go. Thanks for coming. Quantum Eraser will be running in about, I think, an hour on his channel. It's a premiere, so live chat, pre-recorded video. And we'll see you there. So thanks again for coming.